DC did a top 5 fighters of all time list. And it went very viral. Not because it was good and people agreed with it, but because people didn't like it for a lot of reasons. First of all, he didn't have a rubric. He didn't say how he would base this off. Is he judging that list because of resumes? Is it because of skill? Is it because of records? And it was just all over the place. And he had Muhammad Ali at number 3, he had GSP at number 4, so people are going, well, what is this based upon? Is this based on record? Is this based on resume? So I decided to do my own, and I'm gonna base this off who elevated MMA higher, who lifted the sport higher. And I feel like it's just fair to put in boxing, because if it isn't for boxing, where would MMA be? Boxing started this whole thing. If it isn't for boxing, we would not have the UFC. And it's just fair to judge my top 5 fighters of all time by who lifted the sport higher. And at number 5, I would have Ronda Rousey. And I think a lot of people are forgetting what Ronda Rousey did at the time. People were talking about Ronda Rousey, a judo practitioner, boxing Floyd Mayweather, who, if you don't know, was on the number 1 fighter of all time in DC's list. And people were talking about Ronda Rousey, who was a grappler, to box Floyd Mayweather. Now that's how big Ronda Rousey was, and if it isn't for Ronda Rousey, we would not have our UFC 281 co-main event. Carla Esparza vs. Zhang Weili would not exist if Ronda Rousey didn't exist. Just the truth. And I have Ronda Rousey at number 5 because I have GSP at number 4. Now, GSP didn't elevate her sport as high as Ronda Rousey, because Ronda Rousey, she did it by herself. She wasn't doing it with other people. She didn't. But GSP did. And Ronda Rousey, I have to put her at number 5 because of how far she went. How far she could lift the sport up. And GSP did it for a very long time. And I should put him at number 4 because of what number 3 did. Number 4 didn't elevate the sport as high as number 3. And number 3 is Chuck Liddell. I have Chuck Liddell because he's the very first star in the UFC. Very first massive star. Before you had Conor, before you had GSP, all these other guys, before you had those, you had Chuck Liddell, a wholesome guy who, where you put in the octagon, would rip apart every limb that you own. I remember a story that Chael Sonnen was saying that people were dressing up as Chuck Liddell for Halloween. That's how big he was. So I feel like I'm just obliged to put Chuck Liddell at number 3. Because if it isn't for Chuck Liddell, I don't know where the sport would be. I don't know if GSP would be here. I don't know if all these guys that we have right now would be here if it isn't for Chuck Liddell. And I'm gonna put Chuck Liddell because he was first. He started the whole thing before people started doing it. And I have number 2. And number 2 is a bit of a wild card, but it's going to be Dana White. Now it may sound humorous, and that is because it is. Okay, it is very humorous because I had all these names in mind and I put them in a category of fighters and non-fighters. And Dana White was going through the machine. Just to visualize for you guys, Dana White was going into the machine, who's gonna be separated and going into a category of fighter or non-fighter. And at first I thought, well, Dana White is not a fighter, so he's gonna go to the non-fighter list. Let's move on. But then I realized Dana White was a fighter. I believe he fought in the amateur boxing scene. So while Dana White didn't really lift the sport as a fighter, he didn't elevate the sport as a fighter, he still elevated the sport like anybody else. He's like nobody else, I mean. He's unparalleled in that regard. Dana White lifted the sport up. He elevated the sport up in a different level, and he's still doing it. That is what it's impressive. If it isn't for Dana White, where would Chuck be? Where would GSP be? Where would Ronda be? Where would our stars be? Where would Sean, Paddy, all these guys be? Where would UFC 280 be? I wouldn't be looking forward to UFC 281 if it isn't for Dana White. I don't know where I would be if it wasn't for Dana White, if he didn't create the UFC. So I don't know. And I need to put Dana White at number 2 because of that fact that Dana White didn't elevate the sport as a fighter. And I know who did. And I know who inspired Dana White to elevate the sport, and its number 1, his name is Muhammad Ali. Mr. Number 1, aka Muhammad Ali. And I am not doing this to appease, I'm not doing this to please the people that didn't like DC's list. I'm not. I'm doing it because I'm judging by the criteria of who elevated MMA higher than anybody. And why MMA? Why MMA? Why not boxing? Because MMA is the biggest combat sport there is. It's not boxing. It's MMA because it's generalized. So I need to pick MMA, and it just so happens UFC is the biggest MMA organization in the world. So I need to categorize, I need to judge my list based off who elevated the UFC higher. And if it isn't for Muhammad Ali, where would Dana White be? And if it isn't for Dana White, where would all these other guys be? Because Muhammad Ali did it all. He's the guy that started it all before people started it all. He was the egg before the chicken. Or chicken before the egg, I don't know. But Muhammad Ali elevated his sport to the point that another sport that didn't exist at the time was elevated because of Muhammad Ali. The UFC would not exist if it isn't for Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali simply started it before anybody else did, and that is the reason why he's number 1. I wasn't born when he had his first fight. I wasn't born when he became champion. I wasn't born when he retired. I think so, I don't remember, because I wasn't born. But what I do know is that Muhammad Ali as a pioneer, I didn't witness all of his fights, but I do know that he elevated the sport. He lifted it up higher than anybody else. He did it to the point where it's still going. It's still going. And I need to put him at number one. I just need to. He is the pioneer of pioneers. And I know that I'm judging this very differently from how you would judge it, because I'm judging it based off who lifted the sport higher. Now, you wouldn't do that. You would judge it by who beat the better guys, who became a triple champion. I'm not going to do that, because at the end of the day, that doesn't matter. What matters is who elevated the sport higher, because if it isn't for Muhammad Ali, there would be no such thing as double champ. There would be no such thing as 14 title defenses. There would be no such thing as 2 titles and the highest ground control in the UFC. There would be no such thing. There wouldn't be John Jones is the GOAT. You would have to categorize your list based off who lifted the sport higher. Because at the end of the day, those are just details. Those are just details. Now, of course, if you were to make a top 5 most skilled fighters of all time, of course my list would be different. Dana White wouldn't be there. He would probably get smoked by a prelim guy. I mean, probably not. Dana White does pack a punch. I have seen his posts lately. I've been losing weight, but I'm judging it by that because that is what's right. Because all those things, GOAT and all that, those would be obsolete if Muhammad Ali or Dana White or Chuck Liddell didn't lift the sport up. If those guys didn't elevate the sport. So at the end of the day, that is what matters. And that is what's important. It doesn't matter if a guy had 100,000 title defense or if a guy's 29-0, because that 29-0 would be non-existent if it isn't for the guys that lifted the sport higher. Some of you might disagree of how I judged my list, but that is what it is. It's my opinion at the end of the day. You can agree with it or disagree with it. But truthfully, I did a pretty damn good job.